Thank you so much. I've already had a really nice day here. I met with some graduate students, some faculty, other folks, and maybe just a few words just to open, to situate us a little bit. This talk, lecture, whatever you want to call it, is based on the book and the research, but if you have read it, which I know a few people have, which is really, I'm honored by, it's not exactly the same, because I'm kind of reframing it a little bit to draw out some of the bigger picture ideas, to also intersect with some academic areas of inquiry that you might have learned in class or as a professor. So it's a little bit different. It's also more up to date, because history continues, after your books are written. So there's stuff from, the past month or whatever in kind of the material here. One other thing I want to say, because I do see like a range of people in the room with different experiences and backgrounds and kind of where they're at in their quote unquote careers, if we want to use that somewhat annoying language, but maybe you're an undergrad, maybe you're grad or postdoc or do research or a professor. So this is aimed at all of you all, but that means that there are moments, if you're like a freshman in college, that you're like, I don't know that word. No huge deal. You can make a note of it and you can ask me afterwards, but it's not going to stay in any place for too long. So if there's a moment where you're like, I don't understand this part, we're going to move on in a second, so just kind of stick with me. If you're like an in-depth researcher of these topics, like you will, kind of probably understand everything I'm talking about, but I don't like to presume that of anyone in the room. So just a couple of caveats to open, but we will kind of start with an infographic, the type that you can find on Google Images. There are many of these different research outfits and actually for-profit corporations that kind of do these forecasts and predictions about the future. And this is from a kind of well-known firm in this quote-unquote space, Benchmark Minerals Intelligence. Don't worry too much about that, but they forecast like how many mines do we need? What are these supply chains going to look like? There's no investigation of what the we is, what the need means. We'll come back to that at the end, and we'll get more critical about who are we talking about and what is actually necessary for climate and ecological justice. But for now, we're just starting with like the mainstream people and what they say. And they say that to get enough materials for the batteries of electric vehicles, based on what we expect the demand will look like in the next 10 years, actually 9 years, this is for 2035, we will need about 400 new mines globally. So I'll just say a couple of words. 400 may sound like a lot, it may not sound like a lot. That kind of depends on your priors walking into the room. But I want to note right away that that's like a subset of a subset of a subset. Because when we think about an electric vehicle, which we may or may not have done before, the battery is just one component. It is the most important component because it's the most expensive component. It has the most minerals in it. It's the heaviest component. So it's like a big part of the car, but it's not the whole thing. So this is just batteries. And it's not even every material in the battery. It's kind of like a subset that they chose. But let's think about the whole car. We have steel, we have aluminum. That's what a car is made of. Those are all from mined materials as well. We have a motor that connects to the battery, an electric motor. That's where the rare earths are. We might have public charging or private charging stations. We might have wind turbines and solar panels and transmission lines, high voltage, lower voltage. So this is just one slice of the mineral demand for the energy transition as predicted by a kind of normative model. And so 400 is like a sliver, but it's 400 mines. It's a lot of mines. Mines are enormous. They're 2 miles wide, 2 miles deep. They're really big interventions into the landscape. So another thing I want to note kind of on that point is we see this little clip art, what we used to call clip art back in the day of like Microsoft Word clip art for older people in the room. But these little icons that are kind of like cute. This is what a mine looks like. That's not what a mine looks like at all. And so there's a kind of like, this is a little euphemized, we might say. A mine is like an actual place in the world, and as I said, is like a very extreme intervention into the landscape. Humans do a lot of things on Earth and interact with nature in lots of ways, but kind of scientists of mining agree that mining is like a particularly irreversible or difficult to reverse, difficult to really rehabilitate, because you're just digging down into the ground, you're drawing out all this waste, this waste rock, which is the rock that we don't care about that surrounds, these other minerals. You're, maybe contaminating water. We'll get into the environmental harm, but it's very intensive intervention into the landscape. This is one of the mines that's central in my book. I have a few different field sites, but Chile is where I spend the most time. So here we are in the Atacama Desert of Chile, which is Chile is a very long, skinny country. We may or may not know what it looks like, but it's almost the entire Pacific coast of South America. And so there's a lot of different regions of Chile. This is all the way in the north of Chile, and it's called the Atacama Desert. The Atacama Desert is a really beautiful and unique place. We'll see more photos in a moment. It's one of the top tourist destinations in Chile because it's so beautiful and so ecologically unusual. It's the driest desert on Earth. Deserts are dry. That's kind of what defines a desert, is aridity, a water-negative environment. But this is the driest of all of them. And in fact, it's almost the driest place on Earth, of all of Earth, aside from a subregion of Antarctica that's like a little bit drier. So we're talking about a really dry landscape. And it also has other interesting features that I'll just point out. It's really high altitude. It's surrounded by these mountains that look tiny in the background, are like some of the tallest mountains in the world. They're the Andean mountains, right? So you get a sense of scale. And where we're situated right here is called a salt flat. So that is a salty crust formation. They exist in the US as well. Underneath the salt flat, like if you drill down into it, which is what this mining does, there's all this liquid, which is a little weird. You might not think of mine as liquid, but this exists. So it's liquid, it's water, it's brine. You know, like the ocean water is salty. It's like the same kind of salty water, but not in the ocean, on ground. So underneath we have the salt water, and it's filled with lithium, as well as other valuable minerals. They're suspended as ions. I told you we'll get technical sometime. This is like one of those 10 places. So don't worry if you don't have a chemistry background, neither do I, but it turns out, lithium can be dissolved into water. You pump it to the surface like you're pumping oil, but instead you're pumping lithium liquid. And then you put it on these enormous, what these are evaporation ponds, so that, I told you it's a very dry environment, things evaporate quickly, as things go, really high solar radiation. So the water goes into the air as evaporation, and what's left behind is this very concentrated lithium liquid that then enters into chemical refining, battery supply chains. 20% of the world's lithium originates here. Not all lithium mines take this funky form. You might never think of liquid when you think of a mine. Usually it's a hard rock situation. There's also hard rock lithium, there's clay lithium, there's all different types of lithium. In the Salton Sea, here in California, which hasn't been extracted yet, but there's continued speculation about it. It's also brine, but it's geothermally heated brine, so it's like a different category. But this is, again, Chile, 20% of the world's lithium, and that's where I did a bunch of my research. But we can now pretend we're walking like 20 miles away on the same salt flat. This salt flat, by the way, I think you mentioned I'm coming from Providence. That's in the state of Rhode Island, which sometimes people haven't heard of elsewhere in the country. It's such a tiny state, we forget it exists. But Rhode Island, this salt flat is 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's the 3rd largest salt flat in the world. So it's really big. The scale is hard to demonstrate. This is why we have this kind of aerial photography. But this is from a person view. This is my fieldwork photographs. And so if you go 20 miles away, you end up in a nature preserve. Los Flamencos, the flamingos, nature preserve, named after these cute endemic flamingos with their pink feathers. And they are snacking also in salty water, but on the surface of the salt flat, and little organisms live in that water. So everything here is a habitat. There's even life in that lithium liquid. There are microorganisms, crazily enough, that use chemosynthesis to survive. So all this is a very unique landscape, but not one bereft of humans, right? There's often a trope in extractive landscapes that no one lives here, we're not impacting anybody, terra nullius. Not true. And so if you were to keep walking, this would be a very long walk at this point, but if you were to keep walking to the perimeter of the salt flat, you encounter human communities. Ancestral peoples, indigenous peoples have lived here for 12,000 years, so a very long history of human habitation. They have done very interesting forms of irrigation and agriculture, to the point where they can grow things like quince or maize or pomegranate or figs, using, again, interesting methods of irrigation and shade planting and things like that. But I sort of bring all this in to say that all of this, the flamingos, the communities, the agriculture, the water supply, is all impacted negatively with mountains of scientific evidence plus anecdotal evidence from the communities themselves and from folks like me that did ethnography there. It's all under threat by a few things. The lithium mining, which I've mentioned, copper mining, not the subject of my study, but I've done other work on copper. Copper is a very important part of the energy transition, as well as semiconductors, AI, all of this stuff. Chile is the #1 copper producer, #2 lithium producer. And then we have global warming, which is making deserts and everywhere more arid. And so you have a lot of compounding harms on the environment that interact with one another and intensify one another. And so, an obvious question that I'll just plant, kind of rhetorically is like, what justifies, quote unquote, all this harm? Like, it's a very unique landscape. We have human culture, we have animals, non-human nature, we have just astounding beauty. Like, why destroy all of this, to exaggerate slightly, but why harm all of this for the lithium? Like, why is the lithium so important, and like, who decided that it was? And so, again, I'm not assuming anything, even though, I've doing this research for a long time. When I first started, people actually didn't know what lithium was, like 6 years ago. People would be like, oh, the psychiatric drug. I mean, there's different uses of lithium. But now we all have our laptops out, we kind of maybe know, and we know about the EVs, that lithium batteries serve this really important role in digital technologies for sure, in personal electronics, but more recently for the energy transition. And so lithium is this ingredient in all of your rechargeable batteries. It plays two important roles in the energy transition. Actually, more than two, simplifying a little bit, but two very important big roles in two different sectors. So if we look at like what creates all the carbon emissions, there are so many answers to that question, because unfortunately many aspects of our global economy create carbon emissions. But the two biggest buckets tend to be the energy sector, like how we power things, heating, cooling, electricity, the energy sector, sometimes called the power sector. That's one. And then the second is the transportation sector, how we move around, right? All the cars, the buses, the trucks, the airplanes, all of that. And for both of those, lithium's very important, lithium batteries. I'm going to go in the opposite order. For mobility, for moving around, lithium batteries allow you to charge a vehicle with, hopefully, though for sure not always, zero emissions energy. You can charge it up with sun energy, with wind energy, and then it can disconnect, just like you take your laptop out of the outlet. You can disconnect and you can drive around, use that energy, and then you can recharge it again. So that mobile, lightweight, energy-dense battery like allows for electrified mobility, which is helpful for the energy transition. We're going to question a lot of things, but that's like a more or less basic fact. There's many ways, to design that, to make it more just, more equitable, less resource intensive, but regardless, that's the form that batteries serve in mobility. For the power sector, it's a little bit different, because instead of moving around, the battery is staying still. It's a stationary battery, and what that helps with is like the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing, and you might want to use energy at night when the sun's not out, and then what do? Well, a battery on a grid can store that energy. A battery in a private home, if you're really fancy, can also store that energy. A battery in a data center, that's not an energy transition application, but it's an increasingly important one, so that also stores energy, allows it to be deployed when needed. So, not shockingly, based on everything I said, like all the people predict, like more and more lithium will be used over time. I'll say as an asterisk, because there's always someone in the room, yes, there are other battery technologies and battery chemistries out there. I can speak to that. But for now, there's no like commercial exact replacement completely viable that would replace lithium batteries. So we're still in the lithium world for a little bit. And that, given all those use cases that I mentioned, like we're seeing just, up demand for lithium. And a lot of that demand, so I know it's a little hard to read maybe these smaller words, but the blue segment of the bar here is basically saying that the vast majority of the demand for lithium, which is again like why so many mines are supposedly needed, is from individual passenger electric vehicles. Which is interesting because those aren't the largest batteries on Earth. Like a battery on a bus, if we have an e-bus, is bigger. A battery for an energy grid, also bigger, like really big batteries. A battery in a car, not the hugest battery of all time, yet so many cars and so much assumption that we're going to do the energy transition with everyone driving EVs that it adds up to a lot more. And so, you can also just think that the auto sector is like a multi-trillion-dollar global industry. So how much lithium would it take to decarbonize that entire fleet? Not just now, but like into the foreseeable future. So more and more lithium demand expected. The next question, again, we might ask is like, okay, is there enough lithium? So much lithium in demand, maybe there isn't enough to go around. The basic answer is yes, there's enough, but that's kind of like a simplistic way to answer it. Because there's a lot of lithium. There's even lithium in the ocean, like 2% or very low concentrations. So there's lithium everywhere. It's one of the more abundant elements out of the periodic table. But as people, and I know there are folks in the room that study resource extraction or extractive economies, like just the fact that something is underground doesn't mean it's coming out of the ground or doesn't mean there's a lot of production of it or mining of it. And so what we've had is that a few main countries produce most of the lithium. There are some other countries like getting up there in the list, but overall it's like kind of concentrated relative to how much there actually exists in the world. And so what that means, this is one other mildly technical thing perhaps, is like these boom and bust cycles. Because let's say the whole auto industry or like the battery companies or the data center companies are like, we need batteries today. And like there aren't the lithium isn't, mined enough today. Then the prices go up more and more, lithium gets more expensive because there's a lot of demand and less supply. Then let's say, a year later, like let's say Trump gets into office and then he takes away tax credits for EVs or, consumer rebates for EVs, and then people stop buying them as much in one major market, the US. Then we have what's called like softer demand, like the demand decreases, but the supply maybe is bigger because all those investors rushed into it. So we have these boom and bust cycles that are very typical to resource economies. We can see with oil right now, with everything happening in the Gulf. But in general, commodities, like these raw materials, have these very boom and bust cycles because nature doesn't always comply, or like it takes a long time to build a mine. Like it's not, when this demand comes on, you can't just instantly produce the supply. So that happened the last couple of years. The price just went through the roof. It was like completely unprecedented because so many countries and governments simultaneously were like, we need these electric vehicles, we need to decarbonize, and the supply was not there because lithium was actually a pretty small market before that. Then various things happened. There were some recessionary effects after the pandemic. I won't get too much into macroeconomics, but the demand went down, the price went down. Now, this is not up to date. I should have added another because now we've kind of come back up, not to that huge high, but like we're back. So anyway, boom and bust cycles. Now, this has all been secretly leading up to something, which is like how in mainstream kind of typical policy discourse, what a critical mineral is, which may be a term that you're coming across because the terms critical minerals is more and more in the news. But regardless, not everyone knows what it means. This is a shortened version of like the US Geological Services or the Department of Interior, how they would define it, which is basically any mineral that's essential, things we can question of course, but essential for economic functioning and or national security. Those are not the same thing, but they are very tightly linked and conflated in critical minerals definitions. And also where we're worried that we can't get it when we want it. Because maybe our adversary controls all of it, or maybe only one country produces all of it, or maybe some actor that we're involved in a conflict with is disrupting the supply chains. Like there's some reason we quote unquote are concerned. And so when you check all those boxes, you get a critical mineral, and I've kind of already laid this out, but lithium is like really checks all those boxes. And so lithium was added actually under the first Trump government, which is, there's a lot of interesting stuff with Trump and lithium. We'll come back to that, but it was under Trump 1, the first Trump government, that the US government added lithium as a quote critical mineral to its catalog. But I want to kind of take a different view of critical minerals that doesn't contradict anything I just said, but I think like puts it in a different lens, which is that, we might just think like, oh, some bureaucrat in some office is like, okay, this is important now, let me put it on my list. But there's a lot more going on. When that bureaucrat or that president or whatever, whoever directs the process is like, this is a critical mineral, a lot of things change. One, the state, by that I just mean the government, right? The federal US government, also state governments as well, have more power. They can say, this is so essential, we have to fast track it, meaning we're gonna like dilute the regulations, we're gonna shorten permitting times, we're only gonna have one community meeting when we would have had 10 community meetings, like whatever the protocol are, which are already insufficient in so many ways, we're actually gonna reduce that regulation. So that's one thing that tends to happen. Another, connected, is we tend to open the public money floodgates. We'll see much more of this in a moment, but basically all the tax incentives, tax breaks, subsidies, loans, like anything that the US federal government can offer, and also state governments, comes into play. So basically you've empowered the state to like take more of a directed, vested interest in these sectors once you say that they're critical. That all means that also companies are really happy. Sometimes we think like, oh, state gets more involved, capitalists don't like that, because we think of like the state and capitalists as opposite, which is not true, but understandable. That kind of is like a Cold War way of thinking that is still with us. But regardless, like actually when the state says this is really essential, it's important for national security, we're gonna give you some loans, we're gonna deregulate, companies are very happy with that. So we also open up new arenas of profit making with those new forms of state power. And then not surprisingly, all of that raises the stakes of conflict. You have the state really involved, they're saying it's essential for national security, you have companies rushing in. A couple of types of conflicts might unfold. One is for sure what you might think of first, which is community conflict, meaning communities protesting this whole rush of mining in their area. That's one, but also, maybe also in your mind, geopolitical conflict. When the state says this is essential to our national security, they basically made a statement to the world that they're willing to do a lot more to obtain that resource, and that can escalate geopolitical tension as well. So we've seen all of these sites of conflicts unfold around critical minerals, which is a reason, among a few, that I think they're very instructive ways to look at the whole energy transition. So mining, has its own particularities to it, but it also, I think, dramatizes, like it shows in sharp relief the inequalities, the injustices, but also the geopolitical turbulence, the economic volatility that recurs on the whole supply chain. Like maybe even your worst designed solar farm is not as impactful as like your best mine, I mean, if there were such a thing, but solar can have impacts, right? And people do organize around those and try to intervene and make, solar better so it doesn't mess up natural habitat. So each of these issues, whether it's environmental effects, whether it's social impacts, whether it's labor conflict, geopolitical, we can see it everywhere in the supply chain, but mining is just a very intense operation into the landscape and also has this really long history of geopolitics behind it that it's kind of more intense and therefore kind of like shows us all more starkly. So I said on the prior slide, the political economy and the energy transition, which is a lot of wonky words together. But I want to kind of just say what I mean by political economy. Different professors, scholars would define it differently. Always the first two things are up there. When we think about political economy, it's kind of what it sounds like. Politics, economy. So it's like the state, firms, regulators, markets, that type of thing. Like how do these intersect to kind of produce economic outcomes, but also explain the politics of different economic sectors. So that's standard political economy definition, 101, but usually not including social movements. And so I include them out of a variety of reasons: solidarity, interest, friends that are in those movements. I mean, I just think they're very fascinating, these anti-extractive movements. We'll learn more about them in a moment. But also because even if I had to kind of speak to a more, let's say, mainstream political economy person, I could show pretty clearly, and we'll see, that these social movements intervene in supply and demand. They make demand or supply possible or impossible through their political action in a variety of ways. Something not here, which someone might start to think about the longer I stay on this slide, is like, where's labor? Where are the workers? I don't work on that for a couple of reasons. Has not generally been the most salient actor at the mine sites that I've been researching, where the community activism has been much more present. Some of that has to do with this kind of really interesting change in the mining industry, where it's way more automated, way more capital intensive, fewer workers, but it's also just not what I work on. We don't do everything, but I can answer questions about labor and mining if we want to. But these are the kind of like sets of actors that I look at. And we're gonna start with governments in the global north. I'll come to the global south a little bit later. So this is the kind of discourse in the media. That's why I was saying some people may have even seen the word critical minerals, because it's like a lot of headlines about it. These are actually all from like 3, 4, 5 years ago, these headlines. And when I like give this talk, which I've been doing a little bit these days, I try to update things as I said. And I look at the headlines and they're like exactly the same. So like I don't swap out my little screenshots because nothing has changed. If anything, I was capturing this at a kind of early moment of really intense global north, like foreign policy thinking about critical minerals, and the discourse only solidified more over time. And so now this is like very widespread, where at the time it was like a kind of newer thing. But what do we see here? We're worried about shortages. Well, Professor Riofrancos just told you there are not really shortages of lithium. Sure, it's not always available the second we want it, but it's like abundant geologically. Why are we framing this as something that's in short supply, such that we have to like race with our competitors to obtain it? Why is there this implicit or explicit like US-China or EU-China conflict being suggested? Why is lithium so like national security relevant? Like it's making batteries, but why are batteries important to national security? There's like a lot of assumptions baked in here, but they're just from the horse's mouth. Like this is how politicians may think of it, and then the media kind of replicates that. But it kind of raises some questions, which is why do, I say global north, I've just been a little vague. My research was in the US and Europe, in addition to Chile. Most of it was in Chile, but I did these other research stints here in the United States as well as in the European Union. And I was very confused when I first started reading this stuff, as someone that's only studied Latin America. I was thinking like, why is it that these global north governments want to are so worried about mining? Mining happens not exclusively in the global south, but a lot of it in the global south. That kind of works out well for the global north, we import the minerals that we need, whatever, why is there this sudden concern and also desire, as we'll see more in a moment, to mine more locally, to mine more in the US, to mine more in Europe, not just import it from far away? So this is kind of where the policy thinking started going in the early 2020s. And what does that mean concretely? I'll come to the why in a second. This is just the how. How is it that global north policymakers are thinking of attracting mining investments so that they can have local lithium supply rather than importing it? This is, one place where we get a couple of technical terms here, but in short, basically what they're doing is called industrial policy, which you may or may not be familiar with as a concept, but all industrial policy means is the state, or the government has decided some sector is important, we're gonna help the sector come into existence. And so with lithium batteries and lithium mining, there was very little of that in the EU and US by this point in history. Way back when there were more lithium mines in the US, but for reasons, those shuttered. But right now, 85% of battery capacity is in China, battery manufacturing capacity, 85% of that is in China. China is one of the largest sites of lithium mining and one of the largest importers of lithium from other sources. And so, what's going on here, and how do you attract mining companies to come to you rather than to stay in China, to go to Africa, to go to Africa instead, Latin America, where again a lot of the mining happens. The way that you do that is say, companies, I'm going to give you a subsidy, a tax break, so all that stuff I mentioned before. I'm going to fast track your regulations. So it's corporate-friendly industrial policy, because it's not the state intervening in a way that capitalists dislike. It's the state intervening in a way that they do like. And then what I also began to notice is that the European and American policy people were also, if we mine this closer, not only is it better for national security, better for our economic prestige, because these are such important sectors, but also it's more sustainable, and it's more responsible, and it's more ethical. It's who knows what they do in China, who knows what they do in Africa, who knows what they do in Latin America. I mean, it's a lot of Western corporations know exactly what they do in those places, but it was kind of this feigned innocence of over there it's so much worse, and if we mine here, it's so much better. And this argument, I kid you not, you can see it in the book if you haven't read it, this was made under the first Trump government too. It's not just a Democratic thing or a liberal thing, it's a kind of broader discourse that it's more responsible to mine closer to home, but it's also better for national security and for economic, again, prestige on the world stage. And so, why is this happening? I've kind of, I guess, already answered that question, but the US and EU really began to suddenly perceive that China is a dominant economic actor and diplomatic actor in the world. And I say sudden because it was happening. I mean, if you were a China scholar or someone tracing this closely, or even people in the State Department that are more knowledgeable, it wasn't so shocking. But it was a lot of politicians suddenly woke up and were oops, the West, global north, however you want to frame it, doesn't have technological primacy anymore or economic primacy in all of these domains, and is actually losing diplomatic prestige as a result of that. And China is monopolizing all of these things. It was framed very nefariously, but regardless. And so that's why I put scare quotes around the dominance, not to downplay the importance of China in these supply chains, but this framing that's very China is conspiratorially taking over the world. I mean, want to take some distance from. But they believe that, and so they're we got to build these supply chains at home. We can't trust China, we can't trust global trade. We're going to do it in the US or in Europe. And then also, the firms were really into this. The lithium firms, the battery firms, the electric vehicle firms, they welcomed this state support. And they welcomed this discourse that it's more responsible to do it, in the global north. And so I'm just going to run through these kind of quickly, but just to give you a little bit more concrete texture. So in the US and Europe, all sorts of policies were rolled out. 2019, 2020, 2021. It was every year a new policy to say we need more of these supply chains here, and that starts with mining. We're going to set certain targets and goals. We're going to try to achieve this level of self-sufficiency. We're going to reduce imports by that much. So lots of policy activity. In addition to that, a lot of, so this is maybe a little harder to read, but basically you're stimulating the companies here. You're saying, here's tax breaks, here's help, also here's some targets we want to meet. You're also building a wall of tariffs and trade protections to protect those infant industries, we could call them, from Chinese competition. So a lot of tariffs and trade protectionism. And then this is crazy, not possible to read, but it's my kind of favorite slide in a way, because what it shows is like just a portion, but some of the most emblematic examples of public money, so taxpayer money that's being used to basically give money to companies to encourage them to set up shop in the US and Europe. You have to keep in mind that for global mining firms, it is cheaper for them to go to the global south. We could ask why that is. There's a whole colonial history behind like cheapened nature, cheapened people, cheapened landscapes in the global south. And yet that just means that it is cheaper to hire people to get the land, to get the energy, to get the water that you need if you go to Africa or Latin America. So if you are a US policymaker and you want the lithium mines here, you kind of have to compensate them almost for that increased operational cost of the global north. That's one thing, but also just you're creating a sector where it didn't exist, and so you're just throwing all this public money at them. And so, the EU, 400 billion euros to like establish a critical mineral stockpile, but that means money to firms so that they can fill that stockpile with minerals. Lots of joint ventures, loans, all sorts of things. In the US, we have even more money because for various things that I'm happy to get into, but it might be a little boring about how the US, it's easier to hand out money than in the European Union, but regardless, like lots of public money. Under Trump 1, under Biden, under Trump 2, it's a completely like bipartisan consensus at this point that it is good to kind of give money to these firms. But what's happened, and this is where I was saying some of the like recent updates, so you see 2025 and 2026 here, a totally novel thing has occurred in the US. Novel to the US, not like it's never happened elsewhere in the world, but in the US it's unprecedented, where now the federal government, federal agencies own stakes, they own shares in mining companies and mines themselves. And this has not happened before. There are other forms of public ownership in the US, but specifically like owning shares in a mining company is not something like the Department of Energy had previously done, or the Department of War, used to be called the Department of Defense, had previously done. And so now the US government is like a partial owner of multiple mines within the US, though some of them are like foreign mining companies. So it's a little bit weird to think about what the nationalism is there, but it's a big intervention. And again, this is Trump who says like EVs are a scam, but he really likes lithium, and we can talk about why that is. He wants more lithium mining, even if he's not into like decarbonization at all. And so this is changing where mining is taking place, or it's adding new sites of mining. So this is the US West, where we are right now. Here's LA. And so these are the western states. This is an image of a map made by a really amazing biodiversity advocate, Patrick Donnelly, because the US federal government, the US state governments, they do not keep really clear databases of all of the mining exploration and prospects and like putting stakes in the ground. And so he had to compile this himself, but basically this is a bunch of western states. This is from the like height of the lithium boom, like a couple of years ago. There were 112 distinct mining projects being proposed by somebody. And I mean literal stake in the ground. That's how mining starts on federal land. It's something I can answer later. It's like an interesting and very weird and settler colonial legal framework, but so it goes. And so this huge rush, so many companies, so many investors, stakes in the ground. Now, there are not going to be 100 mines in the western US anytime soon, so that's not what this is meant to communicate to you. It's meant to communicate a lot of interest in mining generated by that public support. It's also meant, if you don't know this, that mining is very speculative, so like as an industry for various reasons. And so a lot of times there's stakes in the ground and then nothing happens, or those stakes get combined into one bigger project, the smaller companies fade out. But I would say that like even if a tenth, like 10%, 10 of these mines, so there are like a little over 100 here, get developed, a couple of which already are being developed, that would be a dramatic change to the Western landscape, because these are enormous mines, and the like technological infrastructural affordances that allow them to work, like the energy they require, the highways they require, the water they require, have impacts way beyond the mine site. So even a small percentage of this would be pretty impactful. In Europe, it's kind of, it looks less dramatic because there are fewer little dots, but in a way it's more, because Europe basically does none of its own mining aside from coal, which is kind of, sort of phasing out. But in terms of metal mining, it's all imported from elsewhere. So even to have like a handful of mines in Europe would be like a really big change. Like that is just not something that would have happened without this public money flooding in. one thing I want to say before moving forward, and we're going to come back to the Global South, but just to put a pin in it, none of this replaces mining in the Global South. It's all additive. It's all on top of it. When you have growing demand, more and more geographies can support mining, and the market will, absorb it. And so what we call unequal ecological exchange, that's a kind of wonky but very interesting concept from dependency theory or world systems theory, but basically this idea that the Global South gives more than it gets from the global economy, including in ecological and sheer material terms, will continue. And we're going to come back to that fact. But this adds more mines within the global north to kind of like complement that. So we're going to go to our capitalist actors. We are in this political economy framework still, so we're going down the list. And green capitalism, it says, also on the cover of my book, it is not meant to say that capitalism is green. It is just about what are these capitalists doing that invest in sectors that have been labeled as green by someone with some authority. And so if the US government or the EU government sets up a kind of framework of what industries are relevant to the energy transition, or let's say an investment bank says this is what we consider a green company and we give them this type of loan. I'm just going by those kind of normative frameworks, but within that, lithium firms, battery firms, EV firms, their investors, since it's all tied to the energy transition, or one would think, being a little simplistic, lithium can go to other purposes, of course, but regardless, I'm calling them green capitalists, and I'm asking how do they interact with that state stuff, the government stuff I just said, but also with the big geopolitics of everything happening now. And so this is, a couple other wonky terms. We're only going to focus on number one, but for those of you that read the book or have interest in these 2 and 3 topics, I'm more than happy to discuss them. But I'm just going to zoom in on this one trend for now that I think is interesting, which is vertical integration. Okay, this is very easy to understand, actually. We may have heard of this guy, Henry Ford, back in the day. So Henry Ford, the namesake of Ford, the auto company, we've seen Fords around. So Henry Ford, he invented the Model T, which was the first mass consumption gas-powered vehicle back in the day. But he didn't just invent a car. He invented, or probably it's giving him way too much credit, but he, along with other capitalists of the era, but he was a particularly known one in this regard, invented a different format of production. And there's a couple of things. There's the assembly line, there's tailors, there's all these ways of labor efficiency and labor discipline that we can get into. There's this mass consumption element where he wanted the workers to be able to afford the cars. But what I'm zooming in on is how he organized the supply chain. Because what he thought was, it will be so much more strategic for me as a firm to have all of it available when I need it. So let's say I need steel for the body of the car. I already told you steel cars, right? How do we make steel? We actually forge it with we forge it out of iron in a furnace that's powered by coal. So we already get some raw materials there. We need iron, we need coal. He in-housed all of that into his own company. Instead of saying, I'm gonna buy coal from this guy, I'm gonna buy iron from this guy, he made his own of those things. He even tried to have a rubber plantation for the wheels in Brazil. That did not work out. You can read Fordlandia by Greg Grandin to understand the story there. It's really crazy. But he went to Brazil and he's like, guys, give me some of your Amazon. I'm gonna set up a rubber plantation. The local people did not actually do what he wanted them to do. But anyway, long story. But he really wanted everything inside of the firm. That totally changed with neoliberal globalization, whatever we want to call it, the kind of 1970s to kind of maybe a couple decades ago economic history completely changed that, where firms said, actually, it's more strategic for us to outsource everything, offshore everything, fragment everything. The call centers go, to India. The mines are going to be owned by this other company in Africa. Our service center is going to be here. Our consumers are there. It's completely dispersed, and firms hyper-specialize in one thing, and also don't worry too much about supplies of raw materials, because the market will provide. We're in this neoliberal moment, post-Cold War, the whole integrated market planet, etc. Things start to change for reasons that I won't fully get into, but in the recent decade, let's say, firms are kind of doing what states are doing. So remember I said a few moments ago that governments are we need this supply more secure. We're applying a national security lens to these technologies and their material inputs. We're going to bring it closer to home, re-territorialize this stuff here, onshore it, reshore it, etc. The firms are yes, us too. We're going to directly invest in lithium mines. We're going to have a joint venture with a lithium mine. We're going to own shares in a lithium mine. we're going to sign a contract that gives us 20 years of lithium from this mine. Those are all different methods that are being detailed in this 6-page infographic from the FT from a few years ago. All of these are car companies: Ford, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Tesla. We recognize some of them. All of them are the individual interventions they've made to ensure they have their unique lithium supply, whether it's owning a mine or a really long-term contract, because they too do not trust, let's say, open markets or free trade in this geopolitical world that we live in. And a really, really big specific example of that is this $650 million that General Motors threw down to invest directly in a mine in Nevada that's currently being built. I'm just going to say one more word about that, and then I'll leave this slide, but it's kind of interesting. This mine, Thacker Pass, which I worked on and we'll see some photographs of later, was approved in a fast-track way under Trump 1. So he gave it the green light. It sped through public hearings with very minimal community consultation among Native peoples during a pandemic where people didn't have internet access. The stuff was on Zoom. I mean, it was like an egregious example of how you actually consult a community. That happened under Trump 1, right after lithium was declared, critical mineral. Then Biden, his Department of Energy, gives them a loan that covers 75% of the cost of constructing the mine, which is the biggest cost of a mine, is like constructing the physical plant of the mine. So to say here's a 75% loan, zero interest basically. So that was under Biden. And under Trump, now the US government owns 15% of the mine, like 10% of the mining companies. So and they have this money from GM. So it shows you two things. One is like the public-private sector consensus, the transatlantic consensus, the EU, the US, the bipartisan consensus. Everyone agrees, I call it the critical minerals consensus, that this stuff has to come out of the ground no matter what cost. We're going to throw all of this money at it. But it also shows you how much money is necessary to get an industrial scale modern day mine in the global north. It's a huge capital allocation, and that relates to some of the difficulty of like making this go forward. Okay, I'm going to skip that. We can ask questions about how the firms are navigating geopolitical complexity. That was some of that slide, but I want to get to the global south and to social movements. And so what this slide is, a kind of like little intermission slide before we move there to kind of just remind us, like I've been focusing on these kind of great powers. I don't directly study China, but you can tell China's come up a lot. I've talked about the US, the EU, powerful firms, investors, Wall Street, that kind of thing. But they are really just not the only people in the room shaping these supply chains. And so I'm going to start with global south governments and then go to social movements before we close out the presentation. So what this is basically showing us, we can just go to where are the bars the highest, and that will tell us where the most minerals are predicted to come from. And so basically Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa, I'm excluding China a bit. I can get into that why in a moment, but just putting that aside for a moment, just mainly because China has its own mineral sectors, but those stay in China. So I'm looking at where minerals are exported from. So that's like the quick answer there. But China has a lot of mines, so I don't want to downplay that. But in terms of global supply and export markets, Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa, 2 continents, 1 country, are predicted to basically supply the lion's share of critical minerals for the energy transition. Not even looking at the digital transition, semiconductors, all these other uses of mining. So we could add those on top of that. And so that fact, the idea that like a lot of these minerals, despite the global north building a mine here, a mine there, a lot of these minerals will come from the global south. That fact is very apparent to global south societies and governments. They're very aware of that. And they're, depending on the person, they're hopeful, they're cynical, they're worried, they're enthusiastic. There's all different responses to this idea that we're going to get into right now. And so one big effect this has had is to kind of renew this long-standing discourse and idea in the global south, which is resource nationalism. I had this conversation a little earlier with some graduate students, and we talked about this idea quite a bit. But in short, it's the idea that decolonization is incomplete if all you get is political liberty from the empire. You also need economic control of your resources, because that's where the power really is. And so for like 100 years, and I mean that pretty literally, this idea has been in play in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia, and all of the geographies of former colonies where they decolonized, whether it was in the 19th century or the 20th century, but yet neo-colonialism reared its head over economic relations. So they had political freedom or sovereignty, but not economic. And so it kind of comes in waves. There are moments where global south leaders and societies kind of come back to this idea, and we're in another one of those moments because of all the mining demand. And the fact that maybe we can get development out of this. Maybe if we nationalize our mining sector, or we set up a state-owned company, or we do these joint ventures with other firms, maybe we can like get economic development finally that's been denied to us for centuries. Maybe one just quick thing to note here, because this is probably the most novel thing, so if you're not familiar with some of this policy stuff, this would be like the most interesting one, which are export bans. So that's not necessarily changing ownership, though it can happen with that too. But instead, basically, as a government, you say, you cannot leave our borders, like leave the borders of our country, without actually doing something to these minerals. Like, you get the minerals out of the ground and you just leave. That's like the worst case scenario. That's what people simplistically call like the resource curse or something, because not a lot of economic development comes from just like tearing stuff out of the ground and putting it on a container ship. However, if you say you can't do that, then you have to start investing in refineries, processing, battery production, like whatever it is. You have to do that within the country in order to get their minerals. And so Indonesia, starting in 12 years ago basically, put this into place and said you cannot leave Indonesia with raw nickel. You have to industrialize it here so that we get the industrial development benefits of that. And it's kind of worked. There's an ecological huge amount of harm that attends to that, more in a moment. I don't want to just present a rosy view, but it has worked insofar as in Indonesia, you now have more of the supply chain than you would have had anyway. You would have had, without that ban. And so other countries, like in Africa most notably, have tried to mimic this. Maybe not to as much success, but it's also much more recent. So, we'll see what happens with Zimbabwe's kind of ban on raw lithium exports. Okay, I'm gonna move to just a couple more things about Global South policies, and then we'll go to the social movement. So, all of that sounds good, but it's all very difficult. Like, it's not easy to just say, like, we've got copper, or we've got lithium or nickel, and say, we're gonna therefore locally produce like 21st century technologies when we don't have like a background per se in like those technological sectors. So it's not so easy to do. The foreign firms don't always cooperate with what you want. The geopolitics are very challenging. If you are a country like Indonesia, and as they did, you ban those raw nickel exports, basically that's meant a lot of Chinese capital has come in, which is fine for Indonesia, but like kind of puts it in like the pro-China camp from a Western perspective. I'm not saying the Indonesian government is doing that diplomatically, but you kind of start to side with one part of the geopolitical divide over another, and it's really hard to navigate that. There's a lot of what we call distributive conflicts, meaning let's say you extract all this copper or nickel or lithium, like who benefits from that exactly? Like, does the local community get economic benefits? Is it kind of distributed to like the whole nation in terms of like the economic income from that? And the last thing, and maybe most contentious in certain ways, though second most after the geopolitics, is that global south societies are not tolerant of just like predatory mining with no benefit to them and no regulation or governance. And I'm not saying every community resists mining, that would be a lie, that is not true. But more and more, and I learned this from the mining executives when I go to their conventions to do ethnography, like it's harder and harder to build a mine without some conflict or pushback or protest or litigation happening. And so what the companies call the social license to operate, which is corporate terminology, though sometimes people use it in like the NGO world or whatever, but what it means is like, does society give you the license to like extract next to it? And that license is more expensive, it's harder, it's just harder for them to obtain. And so, but that we can think about the companies, but also these governments are also kind of, from their perspective perhaps, besieged by communities that are like not so tolerant of this whole idea of mining fuel development. And so what we have is like an increasing amount of resistance, and also the kind of big data sets bear this out, where we have more protests, more militant protests, more frequency of protests than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago, et cetera. And so there's many, but just to simplify, a few different forms that anti-mining protests can take. I would say these, upper left and bottom right, the kind of these corners, are a little more typical, which is where you have a mine being proposed, or you have an ongoing mine. So here you have ongoing lithium mining for decades. Here you have a new mine, Thacker Pass. Well, now it's under construction, but regardless, it was then new, being proposed in the US. So you might already have mining, or you might be trying to prevent a mining project. But what you do is you say, let's get organized locally, and we're going to use the fact that if we put our bodies on the line, the trucks can't come to like excavate, the workers can't get into the mine, the mining products can't leave the mine. Like, we have shut it down, and we have done this kind of choke point strategy. So that's typical because mines are localized, they are choke points in global supply chains, and so you can kind of leverage that in a savvy way in community organizing. A different thing is a little less common, but it seems to me anecdotally becoming more common across the world, over time, which is massive protests, like from people that do not live near the mine. Because when we have this many humans, like, these are not people that all live near that lithium mine in Serbia, or the proposed one, it hasn't been built yet, or this mine in the villages of northern Portugal where I did some field work. Like, these folks are in Lisbon, maybe some of them came from the village, but again, many people participating in these protests are not directly affected, which is very interesting. That was kind of not something that was so common in anti-mining protests in the past, but we have kind of more of these mass demonstrations. And then just a couple more protest images that I want to show. This is from my field work in Portugal and Thacker Pass. So this mine, I was here in 2021. This mine still has not been built. The Portuguese government just a few months ago was like, here's another like 100 million euros mining company, like, please open this mine, like, more subsidies. The EU is like really intent on this. But the resistance has been strong, and the companies have like not been very savvy with how they deal with it, so it's just been stalled and stalled. So this may never happen. This might be what we call a stranded asset, where there's some initial investment, but then the mine never occurs. There's many mines that never get developed, especially in Latin America, because of the resistance. Here we are in Nevada, this really cool protest camp that I went to, this beautiful landscape of the Santa Rosa Peak, like all of this. This is now a mine site. This, I'm not extraction yet, but construction. And so there was protest, actually a lot, in the Nevada kind of baseline, but because there was so much support, I told you, Biden, Trump, GM, like everyone was like pushing this mine through, it gets built. Okay, we're now honing in on our end here. So just one final thing about the protest, and then I'll go to my last slide, which is that, as we can see, like, protests can stop supply from coming out of the ground, or can reshape mining frontiers because the activists say, like, you're not going to do it here, and then maybe a mining company goes elsewhere, or keeps sticking it out. But it really affects like project development a lot, this protest. And then the second thing is that protest is not just negative. It's not just like, we don't want this. Sometimes, that's what the protesters might say. But there's a lot of policy ideas and like what we can think of as forms of environmental governance that are being raised by these protesters. And so we can also view them kind of more positively if we want to, like, meaning they have proactive ideas about how to change how mining and extraction operate. And then the last thing I want to say is my final slide here, which is that, I said at the very beginning, like, how much do we really need? Like, how are these predictions, compiled? Like, who is deciding that we need 400 mines versus 300 mines? No one's deciding that, but it's all these forecasts that are kind of, have become taken as truth, basically. And what we did at the Climate and Community Institute, actually in a partnership with University of California, Davis, was look at how much mining is really needed for climate justice, not for like this company to make enough money or for a huge EV to be made, but like if we're going to meet our climate goals, like how much mining do we need? And we ask questions like, well, what if we take more buses? What if we take more bikes? What if we live with more density, like less sprawl? What if we recycle all the batteries? Like all of these questions, and we determine that you can actually get to 100%, carbon-free mobility with less mining, like a lot less mining than is forecast. Not less than today, perhaps, so we can debate that, but less than the most alarming forecast for sure. And so that was helpful to me because it showed that climate justice is not opposed to like preserving biodiversity, preserving indigenous rights. Like these things are not in a zero-sum conflict. There are ways to produce and consume differently that reduce the kind of tension between those goals and reduce the burden on landscapes around the world. So I will leave it there.